I remember that night vividly. It was my third and final night camping alone in Northeast Ohio. The woods had been peaceful for the most part, a welcome escape from the rush of college life, but as the saying goes, things can change in a heartbeat. I woke up suddenly in the dead of night, the kind of wake-up where you're instantly aware and alert. Nature was calling, so I shuffled out of my hammock and stepped about 10 feet away, letting the cold night air jolt me fully awake. That's when I saw it. A headlamp flickering about 80 to 100 feet away. It wasn't moving much, just there, a dim, unsettling orb glowing in the darkness. My first thought was that it might be another camper, but there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I stood there, frozen, for about 10 minutes, just watching. Whoever it was seemed to be making small movements, standing up and sitting back down, like they were waiting for something. My pulse quickened, and an uncomfortable knot twisted in my stomach. I forced myself to move, quietly slipping on my boots and grabbing the hatchet I kept close for situations like this. Situations I'd honestly hoped were just paranoid fantasies. My heart pounded, but I had to see what this person was up to. I decided to move to the right of my campsite, keeping low and quiet. I crept about 50 yards away from my sight and started to circle toward the figure with the headlamp, hoping to stay hidden in the shadows. And then I saw another light, a second headlamp. This one was closer, maybe 40 feet from me, and moving around. I dropped to the ground instinctively, leaves crunching softly beneath me as I tried to cover myself with as much forest debris as possible. The second person walked closer, so close that I could hear the leaves and twigs snapping under their boots. He was maybe 10 feet away, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice me. He stopped suddenly. I could hear him take a long drag of a cigarette, the ember glowing faintly in the dark. Then he crushed an empty beer can under his boot and carelessly tossed it aside. I stayed perfectly still, not even daring to exhale until he had moved far enough away that I felt confident he couldn't hear me. As soon as I felt it was safe, I got up and cautiously made my way toward the first guy, who was still rooted in his spot. I crept closer, the forest seeming louder with every careful step I took. At this distance, I could hear the faint chime of his phone receiving messages. The glow of the screen lit up his face briefly, and I could see him staring down at whatever was on it. That's when he suddenly stood up and started moving, toward my campsite. Panic coursed through me. I dropped to the ground again, watching as he walked straight toward my hammock. For a moment, I didn't move, trying to piece together what I should do. The rustling of the tarp I had set up above my hammock reached my ears, and I knew then that he was trashing my sight. I could hear more voices, more footsteps. Flashlights flickered on and off, and I felt my stomach sink as I listened to the chaos unfolding. My mess kit clattered to the ground, and I caught snippets of conversation. He was just here. I stayed motionless, my face pressed against the cold, damp ground, my heart thumping so hard I thought it might give me away. I watched as one of my flashlights, the large one I'd brought for emergencies, bobbed in the distance, getting smaller and smaller until it was just a faint, taunting glimmer. I waited there until dawn started to creep through the trees, my muscles aching from lying in the same position for so long. When I finally made my way back to what had been my campsite, a sick feeling settled over me. Everything was ruined. My hammock and tarp had been slashed to ribbons, the fabric torn apart by what looked like a machete. My mess kit was bent and stomped on, scattered in the dirt. They had taken my backpack, rain gear, and flashlight. It felt like I had been violated, hunted in my own little slice of solitude. In shock, I wandered over to where I had seen the first headlamp the night before. The ground was littered with chew pouches, 8 empty beer cans, and a used-up lighter. It reeked of stale beer and spit. I kept walking, following the route where the second guy had passed, and came across a filthy mess of cigarette butts, an empty bag that later turned out to be for meth, and horrifyingly, a pile of human waste. No toilet paper in sight. I realized then just how lucky I had been to have stayed hidden, to have survived the night. But the tension, the fear, it's something I don't think I'll ever forget. Our camping trip to Lake Superior started as a college getaway, an adventure meant to break up the monotony of classes and stress. The plan was simple: a couple of nights surrounded by the beauty of one of the Great Lakes, good friends, and the promise of starlit skies. It was supposed to be a chance to unwind and just exist in the wild, no worries other than the odd raccoon or the cold morning dew. The day before the storm was perfect. The lake stretched out before us like a shimmering, endless ocean, and our campsite couldn't have been more picturesque, or more dangerous. We'd pitched our tent just 15 feet from the edge of a cliff that overlooked the water. It felt safe enough at the time, and we loved the idea of waking up to that stunning view. The cliff's height, nearly 100 feet above the lake, added a thrilling touch to our setup. We set up our tent, made a fire, roasted hot dogs, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. We had no idea what was coming. As the sun set and the sky deepened to a velvety blue, a hush fell over the lake. The breeze that had carried the scent of pine all day suddenly picked up, growing colder, and a dense wall of clouds swallowed the stars. I remember looking out over the water, and in the fading light, I could see distant waves turning restless. We knew a storm was forecasted, but we had no clue just how wild things would get. We climbed into the tent, the four of us crammed together in our sleeping bags, and started joking about horror stories of campers getting blown away in storms. Our laughter was nervous, but real. It didn't take long for the storm to roll in, and when it did, it was like the world itself was coming apart. The first crack of thunder felt like a cannon blast, and lightning split the sky open, so bright it seared through our tent's thin walls. The wind was relentless, yanking and tugging at our tent, which seemed to buckle under the pressure. Rain poured down in sheets, heavy enough that our conversation turned to worried glances, and then we fell silent, each of us just listening. It felt like nature was testing our resolve. The tent poles groaned and strained, and at times it felt as though the whole thing might collapse or tear away, leaving us exposed to the storm's fury. I tried to keep calm, but every flash of lightning lit up worried faces. Every rumble of thunder made my heart pound harder. The wind roared, almost as if it were trying to hurl us into the lake. I lay there, clutching my sleeping bag and imagining the worst. A sudden gust tearing our tent apart and sending us flying over that cliff edge. The sound of the rain drummed so hard that it seemed to sink into my bones, relentless, unending. The hours dragged by. Sleep was impossible. Each gust of wind felt like a slap against the thin fabric separating us from the night's chaos. At some point, I must have drifted off, exhausted, but my dreams were filled with images of our tent spinning and falling through black space, of the lake opening up beneath me. It was a restless, jagged kind of sleep that left me feeling drained. When morning finally came, it wasn't a slow and gentle dawn, but a bleary grayness that crept in reluctantly, like a bad hangover. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world soaked and still trembling. The four of us woke up, groggy and sore, our bodies twisted from a night of tension and fear. We didn't immediately notice the danger we'd been in, not until one of my friends pulled back the tent flap and gasped. Our tent had moved. The wind had shifted us during the night. Instead of being 15 feet from the cliff edge, we were now just 3 feet away. 3 feet from a drop that would have sent us plummeting 100 feet straight into Lake Superior. I stumbled out of the tent, my legs wobbly, and stood on the wet, uneven ground. The cliff loomed ahead, jagged and raw, the lake below crashing against the rocks. We stood there, silent for a moment, the magnitude of what had almost happened sinking in. It felt like we had been sleeping on the edge of a knife, and it was sheer luck, or some freak twist of fate, that kept us from falling. The wind had been close to strong enough to end us, and we had no idea until now. Adrenaline finally wore off, leaving me shaky. We laughed, but it was a nervous, almost unhinged kind of laugh, the kind you make when you realize how close you came to disaster. It was a sobering, surreal moment, and as we packed up our gear with trembling hands, none of us could shake off the lingering sense of awe and dread. Lake Superior was beautiful, but that night, we had discovered just how merciless she could be. It was supposed to be one of those unforgettable nights, and it definitely was, but not in the way any of us had expected. The idea had been simple: escape the stress of classes, leave behind the suffocating city, and find some kind of spiritual experience out here in the remote wilds of northern Ontario. The mushrooms were supposed to open up our minds to the universe or whatever, and for a while, it seemed like they did. The stars burned with an intensity I'd never seen before. The lake glistened like a pool of liquid silver, and the trees around us swayed and shimmered as if they were dancing to some ancient forest rhythm. Everything was vivid, full of life. We sat around the fire, the flames throwing shadows that twisted and bent in ways that seemed almost playful. Our laughter echoed through the trees, the kind of uncontrollable, giddy laughter that comes with feeling a million miles away from everything. I felt connected to my friends in a way that only a night like this could make possible. But as the mushrooms pulled us deeper into their strange, colorful world, that laughter started to feel out of place. An uneasiness crept into the edges of my mind, and it wasn't long before the forest began to change. The first howl sounded like it came from another dimension. It rose above the whisper of the trees, slicing through the night air, and settled into the core of my chest like a lead weight. It was long, mournful, and far too close for comfort. My laughter caught in my throat, and I looked around at my friends. The firelight lit up their wide, dilated eyes, and we all shared the same realization. There were wolves out there. What the hell was that? One of my friends, Nick, whispered, his voice cracking just a bit. The mushrooms made everything sound strange, and his question seemed to echo around the camp, twisting in the dark. I forced a smile, trying to mask my own rising panic. "It's just a wolf," I said, but my voice felt thin and uncertain. Wolves were supposed to be scared of humans, right? They wouldn't come too close as long as the fire was burning. I tried to believe that, but the mushrooms wouldn't let me hold on to any comforting thought for long. My senses were heightened, and the woods suddenly felt hostile, alive, as if every tree and shadow held a secret. Another howl came, this time louder, echoing from somewhere behind us. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the darkness, but all I could see were shifting shadows. The fire, which had seemed so warm and bright a moment ago, now felt small and fragile, a flimsy barrier against the wild that surrounded us. The wolves were definitely circling. We heard them, the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig, their movements just out of sight. The sound of paws against the forest floor felt like a countdown, each one making my pulse race faster. The mushrooms played tricks on my mind, making the wolves seem bigger, closer, more menacing. Every sound felt magnified, and I could almost imagine glowing eyes watching us from just beyond the light. No one was laughing anymore. My friends and I sat frozen around the fire, each of us gripping whatever we could to feel grounded. The edge of a camping chair, a half-empty bottle, a stick that was more like a comfort object than a weapon. The tension was suffocating, like the night itself was pressing down on us. Then came the low, rumbling growl. It was unmistakable, a deep, guttural sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It came from somewhere behind me, and I whipped around so fast that I nearly fell out of my chair. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break out of my chest. My hands were trembling, and I couldn't tell if it was the cold, the fear, or the shrooms. "Guys, we need to do something," said Rachel, her voice shaky. Her eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the firelight, and she was hugging her knees to her chest. "Like what?" Nick snapped, his voice rising in panic. "What the hell are we supposed to do?" He was trying to keep it together, but the mushrooms weren't making it easy. Everything felt distorted, the shadows stretching like monsters, the sounds of the forest blending into a symphony of dread. I swallowed hard, trying to think. We had a hunting knife and a couple of hatchets, but what good would they do against a pack of wolves? I pictured them emerging from the darkness, their eyes glowing, their teeth flashing in the firelight. The image was so vivid it made me shiver. Another rustle in the trees, this time directly in front of us. We all turned, the fire crackling between us and whatever was out there. My mind was racing, my breathing shallow, and I could almost swear I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Were they getting closer? Was it real, or was it just my mind twisting reality? The line between what was real and what the mushrooms were fabricating was getting thinner, and I was terrified I wouldn't know the difference until it was too late. Nick stood up abruptly, his chair toppling backward. "We need more wood," he said, his voice breaking. "The fire can't go out." He was right. The flames were our only defense, the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. Or so we hoped. I stumbled to my feet, nearly losing my balance as the ground seemed to tilt beneath me. I grabbed a couple of logs and threw them onto the fire, watching as the flames flared up, casting wild shadows that only made the forest seem more alive. The howls came again, this time closer, surrounding us. We huddled together, our fear palpable. The mushrooms had done their job too well, warping our senses and amplifying the tension until it felt like we were on the brink of madness. The wolves were out there, circling, watching, and the night felt like it could swallow us whole at any moment. We sat there, clutching each other in the flickering firelight, praying the dawn would come soon. Every second felt like an eternity, every noise a reminder that we were far from safe. The wilderness of northern Ontario, once beautiful and serene, now felt like a hungry beast, and we were nothing more than prey, caught between reality and a hallucinogenic nightmare, hoping we'd make it through the night. We shouldn't have picked that campsite. Deep in rural Oregon, the woods felt ancient, untouched, and eerie, even when the sun was high and warm in the sky. The air was thick with pine and damp moss, and the shadows between the trees always seemed too dark, like something was hiding just out of sight. We chose the spot because it was isolated, a place people rarely used. We thought that was a good thing, somewhere we could really disconnect, where our laughter wouldn't be disturbed by anyone. We had no idea how bad it could get.
Mine!
We were a group of college friends looking to blow off some steam for a couple of nights. We planned on only staying for 2 days, nothing more. The first day was fun, the kind of carefree adventure we'd hoped for. We set up our tents, built a fire, and explored the area, weaving between the towering trees and throwing rocks into the river nearby. There was a comfortable sense of isolation, of having the wilderness to ourselves. But on the second day, everything fell apart. It started with a fight. The guy who had driven us there, Chris, was hot-headed at the best of times, and that afternoon he completely lost it. He accused his girlfriend, Jess, of flirting with another guy in our group, and his anger boiled over like we hadn't seen before. His face was red, his voice echoing through the trees, and we all just stood there, stunned and embarrassed as he screamed. Jess tried to reason with him, but it was like he wasn't hearing anything. Finally, with a look of disgust, he stormed off. None of us expected what came next. He got into his car, tires spitting gravel as he sped off down the dirt road, leaving us behind. We stood there, mouths hanging open, waiting for the sound of his car to disappear. At first, we thought it was a bluff, that he'd come back once he'd cooled off. But as the hours passed, that confidence started to erode. We had no cell phones. This was before they were common, and we were at least 10 miles from any sort of main road. Our only transportation was gone, and with it, our safety net. Night fell, bringing with it a cold that crept into our bones and an unsettling quiet that made every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. We clustered close to the fire, trying to convince each other that Chris would return, that he wouldn't actually leave us stranded. The forest didn't feel so friendly anymore. The shadows around us were pitch black, and the wind in the trees sounded almost like whispers. We ran out of food that evening, our laughter and jokes from the first night now replaced with strained silence. Our stomachs growled, and our nerves were frayed. I felt like we were being watched, and I wasn't the only one. Jess kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide and haunted, and one of the others, Alex, started fidgeting with his pocket knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered, and we all froze, straining to listen. The woods had gone unnervingly still. Then, a faint rustle echoed through the darkness, and something cracked, the sharp snap of a branch breaking underfoot. It was far enough away that we couldn't see anything, but close enough to make my skin crawl. "Probably just an animal," I said, but my voice was unconvincing, even to myself. The forest at night played tricks on your mind, stretching out the shadows and turning every sound into something more sinister. The stories we'd told earlier about the ghosts of lost hikers and wild men lurking in the woods suddenly didn't feel so funny. We spent that night huddled around the fire, none of us able to sleep. The darkness felt like it was closing in, pressing at the edges of our little circle of light. The fire burned low, and none of us dared leave to collect more wood. Every noise made my heart pound. Every movement in the dark felt like eyes on my back. Hours dragged by, and the realization that we were truly stranded hit me like a cold wave. There was no way to call for help, no car, no one who knew exactly where we were. We were utterly alone. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, we sat exhausted and uncertain. Our nerves were shot, our stomachs aching with hunger. We argued about what to do. Jess wanted to try walking to the main road, but Alex argued that splitting up could make things worse if Chris really did come back. Voices rose, frustrations simmering, and the feeling that the woods were closing in on us didn't help. Then, as if the universe had taken pity on us, a family showed up late that morning. They came pulling in with a camper, and I nearly cried with relief at the sight of other people. We stumbled over to them, explaining our situation, and they looked at us with wide eyes, probably thinking we were half crazed from the wild. They drove a few of us to the nearest town, where we finally managed to call for help. We got back to our campsite later to collect our things, but something had changed. The place felt cursed, like we'd escaped something far worse than just being stranded. We packed up in silence, not daring to look back at the trees that had felt so menacing. I never spoke to any of them again. That trip haunted me, a reminder that the wilderness doesn't care about your plans, and isolation is more terrifying than you could ever imagine. We should have known the Tetons would make us earn every moment of their beauty. The jagged peaks of Death Canyon Shelf were as haunting as they were breathtaking, and by the end of our trip, I knew we'd always be marked by the raw power of that place. I don't use the word death lightly when it comes to those mountains. The landscape had a way of showing you just how close you could come. It was late in the season, and the weather was unpredictable, as if the Tetons were determined to remind us who was in charge. My husband and I were prepared, or so we thought. The first night on the shelf was when everything started to spiral. The sky darkened with an ominous speed, thick clouds boiling in from nowhere, smothering the last of the twilight. The wind picked up, and I remember tasting the metallic tang of ozone in the air. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then came the lightning. Thunder cracked, not in the distance but above us, exploding like cannon fire. White, searing light painted the entire canyon, blinding us with flashes so intense that shadows seemed to dance around us. I've never felt more fragile. We could feel the electricity, a buzzing tension that made our hair stand on end. We knew the safest position, crouched low, minimizing contact with the ground, insulated by our sleeping pads. And we did just that, huddled together in our tent, whispering reassurances that didn't even convince ourselves. Every strike felt like it could split the mountain apart. The air reeked of ozone, a smell that burned my nose and made my stomach twist. Then, the storm took another horrifying turn. One moment, it was just lightning and rain. The next, the temperature plummeted. A wind whipped around us, and we realized the tent was becoming uncomfortably bright, even in the pitch-black night. Panic spiked through my veins. Was it a forest fire? The idea of being trapped by flames on that exposed shelf was enough to make my heart race. But it wasn't fire. When we unzipped the tent's flap, we saw white, piles of it. 4 inches of snow had fallen in what felt like a blink, blanketing everything. The lightning reflected off the snow, illuminating the canyon with an eerie, ghostly glow. Thunder snow. I'd heard of it, but experiencing it was like witnessing a cosmic battle, violent and relentless. We were miles from any safety, and the storm made that isolation sink in even deeper. We survived the night, but fear had carved itself into our bones. The next day was clear, but the mountain wasn't done with us yet. The sun beat down, melting the snow and turning the trail into a slick, muddy mess. By midday, the temperature had soared to an almost unbearable 90 degrees. We were pushing our way up a pass, well above the tree line. My husband's pack was heavier than mine, and he was sweating buckets, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Dark clouds started forming again on the horizon, ominous and bruised, threatening another electric storm. I could see panic in his eyes. He knew, as I did, that being caught in a lightning storm up there would be a death sentence. We quickened our pace, but the sun baked us, and the elevation made every step a Herculean effort. My husband ran out of water, his face flushed and pale, his movements shaky. We checked the map, but every stream we passed was bone dry, the result of a long, brutal summer drought. He grew dizzy, and I realized we were reaching a point of no return. Desperate, I left him resting in the scant shade of a boulder, hoping that the next bold blue line on the map, just a mile ahead, would be real. I grabbed the empty water bottles and took off. The terrain was punishing, my heart racing with worry. When I finally reached the stream, relief flooded through me. There it was, water, cool and clear. But as I knelt down to filter it, a movement caught my eye. 20 feet away on the opposite bank, a brown head popped up. My blood turned to ice. Another head appeared, and another, a grizzly bear and her cubs. My brain screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to follow the protocol. I stood up slowly, trying to make myself look bigger, my voice breaking as I called out loud and steady, "Hey, bear! Hey!" The mother grizzly locked eyes with me. Time seemed to freeze, every second stretching out unbearably. I braced myself for the charge, knowing I had no one around to help, no way of calling for aid. The last hikers we'd seen had passed hours ago. She watched me, her massive frame full of tension, protective. Then, as if deciding I wasn't a threat, she turned and led her cubs away, fading into the trees. I let out a shaky breath, my legs nearly buckling. I filled the bottles, every second feeling like a countdown, and hurried back to my husband. We made it out, but the Tetons had shown us a raw, merciless side. Hailstorms, grizzlies, thunder snow, and near hypothermia. Each day brought us face to face with something primal and terrifying. It was the best trip of my life, but those mountains claimed a part of me, a fear I'll never quite shake. The annual fall campout with my search and rescue team was something I always looked forward to. It was our chance to bond, sharpen our skills, and embrace the wilderness that we were so familiar with. The air was crisp, the scent of pine mingling with smoke from our campfire. But this year, the woods held something more than just the usual mystery of the wild. Something darker, something I'd never forget. It was late, the sky draped in darkness, the stars distant pinpricks of light barely cutting through the dense canopy. We were in the middle of a night training exercise, practicing our man-trailing and cadaver detection skills. My dog, Brody, a sharp and energetic Aussie mix, was alert and ready. We moved through the underbrush, the world quiet except for the crunch of leaves under our boots. Suddenly, Brody stiffened, his nose catching something in the wind. His whole body tensed, and he let out a soft, urgent whine. He had picked up a scent. "Okay, buddy," I whispered. my breath clouding in the cold air. We followed his lead, moving deeper into the woods, farther from the warm glow of our campfire. The forest grew denser, shadows pressing in on all sides. The air seemed to change, heavy with something that made my stomach twist. Brody was focused, and I trusted him, even though something about this trail felt off. The world around us grew silent, like even the trees were holding their breath. We reached a slick, muddy creek bed. The ground was treacherous, and before I knew it, my feet slipped out from under me. I fell hard, the world spinning as I crashed down the muddy bank, sliding uncontrollably toward a small cliff. Pain exploded through my side, a jagged agony that made it hard to breathe. I'd broken at least 2 ribs, and the impact left me concussed, my head throbbing. Panic flared, and I fumbled for my GPS, pressing the emergency alert button that would signal base camp for help. "Help's coming," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. But Brody, my loyal dog, had vanished into the darkness. I called out weakly, the sound of my own voice swallowed up by the forest. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. A man appeared, stepping out of the shadows. He looked wrong. His eyes were too wide, his smile thin and humorless. He wore a dirty jacket, and there was something about his presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My chest tightened, fear crashing through me like a second injury. "You know," the man said, his voice casual but dripping with something sinister, "a lot of people end up down here." He glanced at the creek bed, his grin spreading wider. "When it floods, like during hurricane season or a freak tornado, people drown real easy. Or they just disappear." I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my ribs, leaving me gasping. I could barely move, let alone defend myself. The man watched me, his eyes calculating as if he were deciding what to do next. He started to pick his way down the bank, searching for a way to reach me. My heart raced, the weight of helplessness settling over me. Every breath was agony. Then, like an angel breaking through the darkness, I heard it. Brody. My dog was coming back, making his signature Aussie talk noises, a mix of trills and barks that I knew well. The sound shattered the tension. The man paused, looking toward the noise. Brody was getting closer, and I could hear his insistent, "Hurry up, slowpoke" sounds that he used to scold me when I fell behind. The man's expression changed, just slightly, but enough to make me think he was reconsidering. Before he could make a move, another figure barreled out of the woods, a massive German shepherd, Ranger, another search and rescue dog. Ranger's hackles were up, teeth bared, his growl low and threatening. The man stumbled back, his bravado crumbling. Brody appeared next, his usually friendly face twisted into a snarl, ready to defend me. And then, my teammates emerged from the woods. One was a former Marine officer, his presence commanding, the other an MMA fighter with shoulders like a linebacker. They saw me, saw the man, and their faces darkened. The man's smile faltered, and he backed up further as my teammates approached. The dogs didn't let up, growling and barking, a wall of fur and teeth between me and whatever terrible fate had almost befallen me. The man didn't run, just retreated slowly into the darkness, never taking his eyes off us. Even as my team stabilized me and prepared to carry me back to camp, the stranger watched. The dogs kept growling until he finally melted into the shadows, vanishing like a nightmare you try to shake off when you wake up. Back at camp, our medics checked me over and I was taken to a rural hospital. One of the nurses told us in hushed tones that this area had a history of assaults, both physical and sexual. It wasn't a safe place, even for search and rescue. I filed a police report, but nothing came of it. To this day, I don't know what scent Brody had followed that led us there. I only know that if he and Ranger hadn't shown up when they did, I might not be here to tell the story. The wilderness can be beautiful, but it also holds terrors, both human and otherwise. Exploring Palo Duro Canyon had always felt like stepping into another world, a landscape of breathtaking red clay cliffs and jagged rock formations that seemed to whisper old, forgotten stories to anyone brave enough to wander off the beaten path. I loved the isolation of it, the quiet broken only by the occasional caw of a hawk or the rustle of wind through desert shrubs. But that isolation came with a price, one I learned the hard way on a day that started out as just another adventure. I was miles from the main trail, my boots kicking up fine red dust as I navigated the rugged terrain. The sun was a relentless, blistering presence in the sky, but I was too excited to notice much, too enamored with the raw, untouched beauty of the canyon. I'd been out there for hours, my backpack heavy with supplies, my skin sticky with sweat. The ground beneath my feet was a patchwork of hard clay and loose rocks, the kind of footing that demanded attention. But I had been too focused on a series of interesting rock formations ahead of me to realize that the earth beneath me was about to betray me. It happened in an instant. One moment I was standing upright, scanning the horizon. The next, the ground crumbled away under my feet. A wave of panic surged through me as I felt myself dropping, my hands scrabbling for something to hold on to. The world became a blur of red clay and dust as I tumbled down into a narrow chute carved into the earth. My screams echoed briefly, swallowed up by the canyon's vast emptiness. I came to a sudden, bone-jarring stop, my body wedged between the tight, unforgiving walls of the chute. My backpack had caught between the rock faces, arresting my fall. My breath came in ragged, gasping bursts, and it took me a moment to process the darkness pressing in around me, the claustrophobic feeling of the chute squeezing me on both sides. My heart pounded wildly, and a sharp pain radiated from my ribs where the backpack straps had cut into me. I tried to move, to assess my situation, and the clay beneath my boots crumbled away, sending loose dirt and pebbles sliding down into the unseen depths below. A chill slithered through me despite the heat. I was wedged in just the right way to keep from falling further, but I was stuck, deep in the heart of the canyon, far off any recognizable trail. The walls of the chute were rough and abrasive, scraping against my skin as I shifted, trying to adjust my position. The thought that clawed its way into my mind, making my throat tighten, was simple. No one will ever find me here. With every movement, I slid just a fraction, the dry clay acting like sandpaper, and the rocks below offering no solid purchase. I started to hyperventilate, the confined space making it feel like the walls were closing in, tighter and tighter. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to calm down, but fear has a way of suffocating reason. I took a breath, then another, forcing myself to steady the trembling in my limbs. Panic would only make things worse. Using my arms and legs, I pressed against the walls and tried to shimmy upward, my muscles straining with the effort. The dry clay was unforgiving, crumbling beneath my hands and feet, sending more debris cascading into the darkness below. I would gain an inch or two, only to slip back, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The silence of the canyon was absolute, deafening, as if even the world around me was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to inch my way upward, my back aching from the strain, my palms raw and stinging. Each time I thought I had a stable grip, the clay would shift, and I'd have to fight back the panic all over again. My backpack felt impossibly heavy, dragging me down, but it was also the thing that had kept me from plummeting further. It was a constant, brutal fight with gravity and the earth itself, a desperate struggle to pull myself out before exhaustion set in. Finally, gasping and drenched in sweat, I reached a point where I could haul myself onto solid ground. I collapsed on my stomach, my body shaking, my mouth dry as sandpaper. I lay there, face pressed against the red clay, too stunned to move. The world seemed to spin, and I was both grateful and terrified. The chute had swallowed me, and somehow, I had fought my way back out. When I stumbled back to camp, wide-eyed and pale, my wife could see something was wrong. I tried to lead her back to the place where it had happened, determined to show her the narrow maw that had almost claimed me. But even though I knew where it should have been, The land had swallowed the evidence. It was gone, like some phantom trap the canyon had set, and then hidden away again. To this day, that chute haunts me. Palo Duro Canyon is beautiful, but it's a place that demands respect, a place that knows how to hide secrets, and it almost kept mine forever. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a few days of peace and solitude in the heart of West Virginia. The sky had been clear, the air thick and heavy with summer heat. I'd picked out a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from anyone else, because that's how I liked it, just me in the wilderness. No cell service, no distractions, just the whisper of the trees and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. But nature has a way of reminding you who's really in charge. And that night, she decided to show her power in a way I'll never forget. It was late afternoon when the sky began to change. The air felt electric, buzzing with an energy I couldn't quite name. I had heard murmurs about a storm rolling in, but this felt different. The horizon darkened unnaturally fast, bruised clouds stacking on top of each other, moving like a living thing. The birds went silent, and a heavy, unsettling stillness fell over the forest. My gut twisted, a primal warning that something was very, very wrong. I had no idea that I was about to experience a derecho, a massive, fast-moving wall of wind that can flatten forests and rip the roofs off buildings. I'd set up my tent inside a small, single-walled pavilion, an old wooden structure that looked like it had been there forever, weathered and gray but sturdy enough. I figured it would shield me from the worst of the wind and any flying debris. As the darkness swallowed up the last of the daylight, the wind started to roar. It built slowly at first, whispering through the leaves, then turning into a deep, groaning howl that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. I zipped myself into my tent, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in my gut, and held my breath. Then it hit. A wall of wind so fierce it felt like the world was being unzipped. The entire forest around me screamed as trees were bent nearly in half. Branches snapped like gunshots, and the pavilion creaked and shuddered under the pressure. I clutched my knees to my chest, my knuckles white, praying the old structure would hold. I could feel the ground trembling, the very earth protesting as roots were torn from soil and massive trunks came crashing down somewhere out in the darkness. I thought I was experiencing the worst of it, but I was wrong. The true terror was just beginning. Over the wind's roar, I suddenly heard another sound, one that made my blood run cold. A heavy rhythmic thudding, something massive moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a split second, I thought the storm had uprooted something monstrous, something alive. The thudding grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw it. A huge shadow moving in the flashes of lightning. My mouth went dry as I realized what it was. A bear. A massive black bear silhouetted against the chaos, lumbering straight toward the pavilion. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The storm was an apocalyptic nightmare, and now I had a bear crashing into my already fragile sanctuary. The animal burst into the pavilion, its fur wild and wet from the rain, eyes wide and frantic. It was terrified, and that made it dangerous. We both were just animals seeking shelter from the storm, but the bear had no understanding of sharing. It wanted this space, and it wanted me out. The bear huffed, a deep rattling sound that vibrated through my chest. It stomped, its massive paws slapping the wooden planks, and for a moment, our eyes locked. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe, afraid that one wrong twitch would send it into a frenzy. The pavilion groaned and shuddered around us, the wind tearing at the edges. But all I could focus on was the bear. Every detail etched into my mind. The glint of its wet fur, the way its nostrils flared as it caught my scent. The bear wasn't happy. It lunged forward, and I flattened myself against the back of the tent, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My brain scrambled for a plan, any plan, but I was trapped. The storm howled, debris slamming against the pavilion, and the bear turned its head toward the noise, momentarily distracted. I took that brief pause to unzip the tent as quietly as I could, inching my way backward until I pressed up against one of the wooden posts. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and a tree crashed down just outside the pavilion, the impact so violent it shook the entire structure. The bear reared back, startled, and for a moment it seemed unsure of what to do. My heart raced so fast I thought I might pass out. The animal turned and gave a frustrated, guttural snarl, its eyes wild with confusion and fear. It lumbered to the far side of the pavilion, torn between shelter and escape. I took the opportunity to grab my pack and brace myself against the post, praying the pavilion would hold, praying the bear wouldn't turn back toward me. Another gust of wind shrieked through the forest, and the pavilion's beams groaned in agony. It was a battle between ancient wood and nature's fury, and I wasn't sure which one would win. The bear made its choice. With a final huff, it turned and barreled back out into the storm, crashing through the underbrush until I couldn't hear it over the wind. My legs gave out, and I collapsed, shaking and drenched in cold sweat. The storm raged on, but my focus wavered, the adrenaline leaving me weak and exhausted. I spent the rest of the night pressed against that wooden post, flinching at every creak and crack, half expecting the bear to come back, or the entire structure to collapse. Morning finally came, pale and gray. The forest was a war zone, trees splintered and fallen, branches scattered everywhere. The pavilion still stood, but only barely, and I stumbled out into the wreckage, every muscle aching. The terror of that night would haunt me for years, a brutal reminder of how powerless we really are against the forces of nature and the wild things that call it home. We were at the Grand Canyon camping. It was supposed to be one of those adventures you remember forever, the kind of family experience that feels larger than life, surrounded by awe-inspiring beauty. The canyon stretched out around us, a vast, breathtaking expanse, its walls shimmering in the midday sun. It was over 100 degrees, the kind of heat that presses down on you, making the air heavy and hard to breathe. We'd set up our campsite, our little 3-year-old daughter laughing and running around, her energy seemingly immune to the scorching sun. One moment she was there. I swear, she was right there. My husband and I were unpacking the last of the camping gear, and she was playing with some sticks and rocks by the tent. Her giggles still echoed in the air, mingling with the rustling of the dry canyon breeze. And then suddenly, it was quiet. Too quiet. "Where's she at?" I asked my husband, my voice laced with a forced calm, that kind of parental tone you use when you want to pretend everything's okay even when you feel a seed of fear taking root. He looked up from his work, and we both scanned the campsite. Our daughter was nowhere in sight. "Sweetie?" I called out, turning in a slow circle, my eyes sweeping over every inch of our small campsite. Nothing, just empty space, and the heavy silence that seemed to mock my growing panic. "Honey?" my husband called, his voice a little louder. There was still no answer. The air around us felt stifling, pressing down on my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to breathe, trying not to jump to the worst conclusions, but my mind was already spiraling. And then I lost it. "Where is she?" I screamed, my voice cracking. I ran to the edge of the campsite, looking for any movement, any flash of her tiny pink shirt among the rocks and dry scrub. I shouted her name over and over again, the sound echoing uselessly into the empty canyon. I sprinted back to the van, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. I wrenched open the sliding door, desperate. "Honey?" I called, peering inside. The van was a mess, as it always was, our bags half unpacked, clothes and snacks scattered. No sign of her. My heart felt like it stopped. I shut the door again, and the sick feeling in my stomach spread like poison. "She's not in the van!" I yelled, my voice strangled with fear. The world felt like it was collapsing in on me. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't stop moving. I ran from site to site, barely aware of the heat burning my skin, screaming her name to anyone who might be around. My husband was doing the same, running in the opposite direction, his voice cracking with the same desperation. We were both in a frenzy, our souls shredded by the sheer terror of the moment. The Grand Canyon, this place we'd come to marvel at, felt like a monstrous, endless void. My mind raced with horrifying images. The sheer drop-offs, the cliffs, the wild animals that prowled the shadows of the canyon. It was an unrelenting nightmare, and I couldn't wake up. I couldn't even think clearly. And then suddenly I heard my husband shout, "I found her!" Relief and confusion flooded me all at once. My legs nearly gave out as I turned and ran back to the van. I reached it, gasping for breath, my chest heaving, and found my husband holding our daughter. She was alive, unharmed, her face flushed but otherwise perfectly fine. Tears blurred my vision as I rushed to her, grabbing her in a hug so fierce that she squirmed and whined in protest. "Mommy!" she giggled, oblivious to the hurricane of emotions swirling around us. I sobbed, clinging to her, my hands shaking as I touched her face, her little arms, her curly hair. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, a bit confused but happy. My husband explained, still pale and trembling. "She was in the van," he said, his voice thick with relief and shock. "Hiding. She was hiding under the clothes." My stomach dropped. I had checked the van. I had been the one who opened the door, called her name, and shut it, not knowing she was there, not knowing she had crawled under a pile of clothes, playing her favorite game, surprise hide and seek. It was something we'd taught her months ago, a playful trick where she'd hide and giggle when we couldn't find her. But here, on this sweltering day, that game had almost cost us everything. The realization slammed into me like a physical blow. The van, baking in the desert heat, could have been a death trap. It was over 100 degrees outside, and inside, it must have been even hotter. My knees buckled, and I sat in the dirt, still clutching her, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I don't remember how long I stayed there, holding her, feeling my heart slowly come back to life, thumping unevenly in my chest. My husband sat down next to me, both of us dazed, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. Our daughter squirmed in my arms, her little hands pushing at my face, giggling and asking to be let go so she could run around again. I pulled her close, kissing her forehead, my tears soaking her hair. That night, we canceled the rest of our camping plans. The canyon felt like a predator, like something that had almost swallowed us whole. We packed up and found a nearby cabin, a small, safe bubble of civilization where we could breathe without feeling the world pressing down on us. Even now, thinking back on that day makes me feel sick. My soul left my body in those moments of terror, and the fear still lingers, like a shadow I can't shake. In another universe, a version of me never found her, and that thought haunts me. I've had scary moments in my life, but nothing has ever compared to the raw, primal horror of losing my child in the Grand Canyon, of thinking she was gone forever, swallowed up by that vast and unforgiving wilderness. We were lucky, so lucky, and I'll never forget it. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful winter hike, a chance to escape from the stress of daily life and find some peace in the barren beauty of the Indiana Dunes State Park. The snow had come down hard the night before, and the entire landscape was blanketed in a heavy, pristine layer. The park was silent, almost hauntingly so, and as we stepped out of the car and made our way through the entrance, I felt that particular kind of thrill that comes from exploring a world remade by snow. The air was crisp and biting, the kind of cold that stings your nose and makes your breath come out in visible clouds. The dunes were smoothed over by snowdrifts, their shapes softened and made alien by the blanket of white. The lake, Lake Michigan, stretched out in the distance, frozen and covered in a thick crust of snow that was indistinguishable from the land around it. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional rustle of wind that seemed to carry the chill of something ancient and wild. We walked slowly, marveling at the way the snow seemed to mute the world. It felt like being in a dream, surreal and impossibly still. With every step, the landscape became more disorienting. The snow had transformed everything into a uniform whiteness, and the usual markers, The curves of the dunes, the shorelines, were buried under feet of it. We didn't realize how dangerous that illusion would become. We kept moving, laughing, and talking quietly, unaware that our path had gradually shifted. The snow was deep, and it was hard to tell exactly where we were. It all looked the same, a perfect, unbroken expanse of white. We wandered for what felt like ages, never once considering that we might have strayed too far. The park was empty that day. There were no other hikers, no one else's footprints to follow. It was just us, two small figures swallowed up by a vast, frozen world. I remember the exact moment the feeling of unease set in. We had stopped to take a break, and as I looked around, a shiver of dread ran up my spine. The view was too wide, too open. The dunes that should have framed the edges of our path were nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was an expanse of snow stretching endlessly in all directions, and the horizon seemed unsettlingly flat. It didn't feel right. Something was off. "Do you think we're still on land?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though a tightness had crept into my chest. My hiking partner, who had been brushing snow off his gloves, paused and looked around. His face went pale. It was as if we were both suddenly realizing the same terrible thing. We had walked too far out, and not onto solid ground, but out onto the frozen lake. The realization was like a punch to the gut, and my heart began to race. We had no idea how thick the ice was beneath our feet, or how safe or unsafe this whole expanse of snow-covered lake really was. "Don't panic," he said, but his voice was tight, strained. We both knew that the ice beneath us could give way at any moment, and if it did, there was no one around to help. The park was deserted, and the idea of falling through the ice, of sinking into that freezing black water, was almost too horrifying to comprehend. No one would have known where we were, or what had happened. We would simply vanish, swallowed up by the lake. We turned and started walking back the way we thought we had come, trying to keep our movements slow and deliberate, each step measured. My mind raced, every noise, every groan and crack that echoed across the ice, making my heart leap into my throat. The lake ice has a way of talking to you, of creaking and moaning even when it's stable, and each sound felt like a warning. I imagined the ice beneath us spiderwebbing with cracks, giving way to freezing water that would numb us within seconds. We trudged on, the snow crunching beneath our boots. I kept my eyes on the ground, terrified that I would see the snow start to shift or sag, terrified that any second we would feel that sudden, horrifying drop. My breath came in short, shaky bursts, my chest tightening with a mix of panic and the cold air burning my lungs. Then, finally, we saw it. A sign, half buried in snow but still legible, a warning that read, "Dangerous ice. Do not proceed." It was facing the opposite direction, meant for those venturing out from the safety of land toward the frozen lake. We had passed it without even noticing. It stood there like a grim reminder of what could have happened, what almost had. A wave of nausea washed over me. We had walked at least a quarter mile onto the frozen lake, oblivious, laughing and carefree, completely unaware of the danger beneath us. The realization hit like a second wave of adrenaline, and my legs felt weak with relief and leftover terror. We had been so close to disaster, so close to disappearing into the icy grip of Lake Michigan with no one the wiser. We stumbled back to the safety of the shore, our legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The weight of what had almost happened clung to me like the cold, an invisible shadow that wouldn't let go. We made our way back to the car in silence, the spell of our peaceful winter adventure shattered. The park, once so beautiful and serene, now felt ominous, like it had been waiting to show us its darker side. As we finally drove away, the snow still falling in soft, lazy flakes, I couldn't shake the feeling of how fragile we were out there, how close we had come to disappearing beneath that serene, deceptive expanse. The snow had almost swallowed us, and no one would have known.